Hello, I'm Tomasso Franceschi. That's Italian for Tom, the French guy. And there's a story because there's always a story. But basically, I wanted to be old Tom, the storyteller, uh, which I do. Uh, this is music by Alonso Mudarra, who was a Spanish composer who was educated in Milan but went back to Spain and wrote about 300 pieces that we have for the Vihuela and La Guitarra. The guitarra being a four-string instrument in period, which we'll get to presently. This is his pavana for guitar. So that's played on a baritone ukulele, tuned to low G for those of you who are, all it takes is about 100 hours of practice, Margaret. So let me toss out a question for y'all. What is a guitar? You can answer in chat or just unmute yourself and shout it out.
A guitar is a multi-string plucked instrument, the number of strings changing depending on the time period, traditionally made with strung with gut strings, and plucked with either the fingers or a plectrum, depending on the tradition and time period.
Don't forget the resonance chamber that goes with it too.
Say again?
Okay.
It's got a it's got a resonance chamber that it with an an outlet for the sound to come out.
In my notes is a wonderful quote from around 1613, if memory serves me. That up said, there aren't as many people who play the vihuela anymore. They play the guitar, which is nothing more than a cowbell. Every stable boy and manservant thinks he's a musician when he strums his guitar. You can, there's a lot to unpack in that very short statement, talking about, which tells you an awful lot, that the vihuela was a high-class instrument and the guitar was a low-class instrument. And people strum the guitars. A great way to find out if people are doing something is find some nobleman or some preacher complaining about it. And there's an awful lot of that. One of the reasons we know that, for example, Morris dancing this period is because a couple English kings banned it. And we have a record of outlawing Morris dancing. So a guitar is a late period instrument and it's constructed. So it's made out of different pieces of wood. All of the guitars that we have that survived are built out of, boards either shaped into the familiar hourglass shape, and then paneled with angles and all sorts of complicated woodworking. This is a contrast with the earlier instruments that were carved. Nowadays, we refer to them as sautoir and sauterne are the most common ones, where they take a big honking block of wood and hack it out, and there you have, that gives you your sound chamber. I got to judge one at Middle Kingdom 50-year ANS, a beautiful, beautiful piece of a carved instrument, just a wonderful piece of luthier. So in Spain, after the Moors left, all the rest of Europe took the oud, made it into the lute, and was making these bowl-shaped instruments. You had the lute, you had the earliest mandolins, very late in period to the beginning of the very beginning of the 17th century. You got mandolins that were bowl-shaped. In the Iberian Peninsula, they were making rectangular instruments. But if you look at the vihuela is a rectangular instrument. Look at the guitarra is a rectangular instrument. There's a lot of theories for that. One idea was it was those Arabs who made things bowl-shaped, and they were just doing it differently. The other idea was, if you look at a bowl-shaped instrument, see that it's made out of a lot of very narrow strips of wood, pieced together very carefully. But if you look at the back of even a modern guitar, you see this big honking flat piece of wood. It's all one piece. So when you get the technology to be able to make a smooth piece of wood that's big enough to the back of your guitar and the front of your guitar, at that point you can start building constructed instruments. So there's always questions about how the technology develops and how the luthier develops. One of these days we're going to pull something out of a bog. We're going to find something in a shipwreck. We're going to find something, and it's going to tell us a whole bunch of stuff we didn't know. And it's always like that. Anything I tell you today, if we find something tomorrow that makes the whole thing invalid, that's the way this game goes. And sometimes you're pedaling as fast as you can just to keep up with what's current. Now, so guitar is made out of multiple pieces. That was a huge innovation. Metal. Yes, metal smithing. I think that's probably true. Movable frets were kind of characteristic of any instrument at the time. The first fretted instruments, viol da gamba, any of the viols, the lutes that had eventually acquired frets, they all had movable frets at that point that were tied. I know one viol da gamba player that I know on her instrument has a G sharp fret and an A flat fret, which nowadays are the same note, but they're far enough apart on her instrument that it makes a difference. So in Spain, you had the vihuela. The vihuela was a 6-stringed instrument. It was so similar to the lute. It was the same length, and it'll come up a lot of the time in our discussion. The most important length on any fretted stringed instrument is the scale length, which is the length from the bridge here, hold it up so you can actually see it, to the nut here. That's the most important dimension on any fretted stringed instrument, because that tells you tells you how far the frets are going to be apart. It makes things possible or impossible to play. Think about it. If the scale length were 8 feet and your frets are this far apart, you're going to have a very hard time playing 2 notes at the same time on different frets. So that's a very important dimension. That dimension is the same on a 15th century lute as it is on a 15th century vihuela. The 15th century vihuela has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 strings, go 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1. And the exact same arrangement of strings and exactly the same tuning is what you found at the lutes of the same period. So there's got to be some kind of an element of, we're not going to build these instruments the way those Moorish people built instruments, because they were building very similar instruments. You can play lute repertoire on a vihuela and vice versa. And the guitar was its little cousin that had 4 strings, or actually 7 strings, 2, 2, 2, and 1, 2, 4, 6, yeah, 7 strings. Her brain's falling out of my head. Now, there were 3 forms of both the vihuela and the guitar. There was the vihuela version, usually was played by the fingers, which was also called vihuela de mano, and we also have guitarra de mano. Then you had vihuela de arco. I haven't seen anything about guitarra d'arco. They may have just regarded that as a smaller vihuela. What's interesting with that is when you go to Italy, you have viola and viola d'arco and viola mano that became the same name as the modern viola, but that was also the name of the guitar in period. So the names get very complicated and very, very hard to sort out. If you hop over into England, you find they call the guitar the guitarn. And if you look in Tudor wills and Tudor customs records and things like that, you find that they're importing these 7-string guitarns from Spain. And they're frankly plagiarizing music from French. There was a French publisher, Morlaix, who was publishing guitar music, the music for the 4-course Renaissance guitar, and the English were plagiarizing him. So there was music that we thought was lost from Morlaix in France, but it turned out that an English publisher had published it, had plagiarized it, so we're able to reconstruct the French version based on what the English had stolen. Now, the English also had an instrument that was called a guitar. And that was a different instrument. Nowadays, we look at, if we saw an English guitar from late period, we would look at it and say, oh, that's a sauterne. And the thing that we call a sauterne is what the English were calling a guitar. The thing that we call a guitar, they were calling a guitarn. If you hop to the end of the Iberian Peninsula of Portugal, you had a different guitar that is still played in Portugal to this very day, Portuguese guitar. And that's a completely different instrument than the modern guitar, than the, it's got 6 strings like the modern Spanish guitar, but is completely different with its own traditions and its own style of playing. So you have to be careful when you look at the names of something. Now, you run into this in my friends that are really, really good with fiber talk about, what is it, curdles? That there's 1,000 different things that are called curdles. And wherever you go, they've got a garment called a curdle, but no 2 are alike. So it's kind of similar, whereas words migrate at a different speed than artifacts do. Now, modern builders are kind of all over the map. There are people who are building serious Renaissance 4-course guitars with 4 strings, with the classic shape of, if you see a vihuela, you see a guitar from period. It's very much that much more straight shape than nowadays they're much more curved. Back then it was sloped in just a little bit. So you saw that, there are people who are reconstructing them and doing incredible work for, a nice big jar of money. There's also people that are building, usually you see it in the form of a lute-shaped guitar. And those are okay. They also make lute-shaped ukuleles. And those can be okay, but you have to be a little bit careful, because anytime they're building anything that's not standard, a lot of the time they come up with a really cool shape, but don't do such a great job of building it. I have seen some of those that have been very nice. I've seen some of those that would look really good hanging on the wall, but they're not very playable. So particularly if you're starting out and want to learn how to play any of the dance music or any of the other stuff we're playing on an instrument, be kind of careful at the budget end, especially. You're almost always better off getting something in a more standard configuration, and rather than getting something that is lute shaped just because it's lute shaped, just because the workmanship very often isn't there, and you wind up fighting the instrument more than you wind up playing the instrument. Now, with the guitar, the way the guitar evolved is kind of interesting. They were all built very much the same until the 19th century, when Spanish luthier Torres came along and started experimenting. And so the earliest instruments we have are braced like a ladder. And if you see a lot of ukuleles are still braced with a ladder. Torres came along and he invented a whole new style of bracing. In fact, he built himself a paper mache guitar body, because he had convinced himself that the only thing that mattered in the tone of his guitars was how you brace the top. So he had this paper mache guitar body, and he kept slapping different tops on it until he came up with what you'll buy if you pick up a classical guitar nowadays. It's almost always going to be braced very similarly to the scheme that Torres came up with in the 19th century. And that didn't change until the early 20th century, when Martin Guitars and the other builders who were contemporary to them started building these very sturdy, very rigid, with X braces and lots of modern glues and things, to stand up to the rigors of modern steel strings, which have a lot more tension. It's not the first instance of metal strings. There were metal strings on the English guitar. To the best of my knowledge, that's the instrument that Ben Franklin played. Now, the guitar itself did acquire a fifth set of strings in the see, this is one of those things that's changed in the past 2 years since I've been studying this. I've found out more. Originally, we said that the Baroque guitar of the 18th century had 5 strings, and the 6-string guitar didn't come out to the 19th century. Well, that's moved up. Now we kind of think that very, very late period, like the 1580s, you started to see 5-string guitars. And in the middle of the 17th century, you started to see 6-string guitars. So that's kind of how that whole thing developed. The guitar and the Vihuela were both Iberian. They both had the figure-8 body shape that we're familiar with in modern guitars, and it had with the flat back. The earliest music that we have surviving for guitar was from the collection I played from before, which is Alonso Madara's Tres Libros, 3 books. 3 books of music in code. It's all written in tablature. And if you've played tablature on guitar, you'll wonder what these weird sounds are until you figure out that it's Italian tablature and it's upside down. I have one of the links in the notes that Yo Mama will provide for us. Does have my transcriptions into modern notation, which includes the tablature, so that you can play this music. So Madara's collection is from 1546. And he had in his collection of 300 some pieces for Vihuela, he has 6 pieces for 4-course guitar. And I've transcribed those and my brain exploded. And I started 4 years ago. I just posted my last set of corrections a week ago. Because as you try to play the things, you realize, hey, I'm missing this detail, I'm missing that detail. Oh, that's really hard to play. And then you reassign the string as you work through them. It's I'd like to say I'm done, but every time I say that, it turns out I'm not done. There is another collection in yeah, there's a very large collection from France, published by Leroy and Ballard, and lots of songs and dances and all kinds of other things. I hope that's the right link, because that's the one I sent you that said that worked. As we get to the 17th century, the guitar, it becomes very much an accompaniment instrument. There's less music written for it formally, but there is a lot of dance music that survives. There is music that survives for instruments that don't survive. A couple of pieces that we have that were written for 4-course guitar were written for 2 guitars that were tuned a fifth apart. So just like you would have a chest of lutes, where you have a bunch of lutes in all different sizes, or a chest of recorders of all recorders, there seems to have been such a thing as a chest of guitars, with all guitars, with 2 guitars, different sizes with different tunings. We don't have any of the larger guitars. We only have the small ones. So somewhere out there, as we say, in a shipwreck or buried in the rubble of some old castle, there may well be one of these larger guitars out there for playing these duets that were written. I actually have a larger baritone ukulele here that is tuned that way. And if I ever find someone who's willing to play them with me, I'd certainly be willing to try it. Because so when we talk about guitar, you probably want to know how it's tuned. And this is where it kind of gets interesting. So the way a modern ukulele is tuned is actually 2 ways. The first way is pretty much equivalent to the top 4 strings of the guitar. Now, when we say equivalent, what I mean is that the interval from this, for the top 4 strings, the interval string to string is the same as it is on a guitar. So anything that you can play on the 4-course guitar or on the baritone ukulele with low G string, you could play on a modern guitar on the first 4 strings. Okay, quick check. For those who are unfamiliar, we number the strings bottom to top, and it confuses the heck out of everybody until you get used to it. So the bottom string is 1, not the top string. Now, that is a documented tuning. It's the tuning that was used in Madara's pieces. He has 2 different tunings. One is called old tuning, one is called new tuning. This is new tuning. Old tuning is you drop the G string to F sharp. And there aren't a lot of pieces in that. The other tuning, and the one that is more common in the smaller ukuleles, is called reentrant tuning. Reentrant means that instead of climbing up, we drop down. And the other documented guitar tuning is exactly this tuning. So you can find music that is written for the tuning of your smaller ukuleles. Already there, already written for you, already period music. So you don't have to spend $3,000 on a lute. That's good news. You can spend 50 bucks on a very playable ukulele and play period music in its original key. Now, there's a whole section about how we describe and compare tunings, and we talk about Joni Mitchell actually documents how she tunes her instruments for any song. And one of the times I taught this, there was a viol player, and she said, "Oh yeah, we do that in viol playing all the time because we have to keep, retuning for different songs." So it's something that was older, but I haven't found an original source for it. So I just call it how Joni Mitchell describes tunings. There's a whole section in the document about that, just talking about. So the options, so this is a documented tuning. Put that one too far away. And this is a documented tuning. The third documented tuning is with this string doubled at the octave. So it's playing this note and the octave higher. So you've got both notes. So the two notes are tuned an octave apart. Now, all three of those tunings, I could go right down to elderly instruments. If I got there before they closed, I could go down to elderly instruments. I could pull a ukulele off the wall that was tuned in that exactly that way. So everything, every modern ukulele tuning is a documented 4-course guitar tuning. So that's what got me, the prospect of playing it, being able to play period music in its original, very close to its original form on instruments I already owned. And if I didn't own them, you could pick up for under $500. That's a pretty big deal when you consider what other than say a recorder, you can get a really good recorder for 20 bucks. It's plastic, but it's a really good recorder. And compare that to the entry level for a harp or a reproduction Vihuela. That's a pretty big deal. Well, so if you're entering your baritone ukulele piece in A&S and I'm sitting there and I say, "So, my lord, tell me what's the difference between this instrument and the original instrument?" What I would say is, well, they are both constructed instruments. The period instrument doesn't have there's a hard piece of, in this case, it's actually a countertop material on the at the nut and at the bridge. That period instrument just has wood there. The bridge of the period instrument is further down. This is right near the center of the bout. That's mechanically more efficient. So those two things mean you get a lot more sound out of this instrument than you would out of the period instrument. Period instrument would also be strung with gut strings, which are also softer. So one of the things you have to be aware of is that it can make your tone. Usually that's true because remember, you got to think about the wear and tear. But they certainly didn't use hard plastic. I haven't seen a bone saddle. It's very, nowadays they love to use bone in more expensive instruments. I haven't seen that in a period instrument or a period reproduction. So that's the way I've normally seen it. But again, I always have to preface that with, tomorrow we find something that changes everything we know. But for the ones that I've seen, that's the case. The other thing that's going to affect your technique is you'll see that the fingerboard is raised by about 1/8 of an inch above the body of the instrument. That's not the case in period fretted instruments. The period fretted instruments, you don't have the raised fingerboard. That raises the action a little bit, that forces you to play a little bit more slowly. Now, if you've got strings, that's not as big a deal as it is with wire strings, but it does still do things. It does still affect that. The other difference, this is probably the most important one, is the fact that period instruments have tied frets. And tied frets can be moved. Now, there are some instruments that I've seen that actually have a little groove. I see this a lot on lutes. They actually cut a little groove where the fret is supposed to go. So even though the frets are tied, they're stuck in the same place. But you can move the frets if they're tied. So if you're going to change your tuning for a different piece, that's another thing that will be different when you're, that's going to be different. That's going to affect how things sound. If you're not entering an A&S competition and no one's going to ask you, just play it. Is it going to sound different than one tune more close to a period tuning? Yeah, but a lot of the, as it turns out, a lot of the repertoire is in a very limited range of keys. So it's not like you're playing in a key that's not friendly to the instrument, as you'll see in later music. And music where they expect the capability of playing in different keys. There are similar instruments, both in the Iberian Peninsula and also in places that they have settled. Let me get there. In the period music that I've encountered, they tell you what the tuning is, usually in the preface. Usually in the preface to the volume, they'll say, tune this way. And you can kind of infer if you play what the tablature says, that it's a really, really dissonant sound. If it's written in notes, then if the music is written in notation, then the actual tuning doesn't matter so long as the note exists on the instrument. Okay, yeah, so the tuning was in the treatises about the instrument, often in the volume of the instrument. The description of the guitar is, imagine a Vihuela, but you took the first two strings, the bottom two strings off. And that's their description of the Vihuela. The key is, if you're in tablature, their tablature is telling you what string to play and where to fret it. So if your tuning is right, it will be in the right key. But the tablature itself doesn't have notes. If you look at the original, it has note values, has durations, but it doesn't actually tell you what the pitch is, because it's giving you the position on the fretboard. It's not telling you the actual note you're playing. So it's a little funny. They didn't really they were writing in tab. They weren't running in notes, but you can tell sometimes there's some transcription errors. Like on any stringed instrument, there's more than one way to play most notes. So you'll look at the tab and you'll see 2 notes and your fingers are stretching 7 frets. And if you think about it, that's hard. But if you move it over one string, all of a sudden you're only stretching 2 frets. So that's obviously a transcription error when he wrote it, took it from the music that he wrote and transcribed it to tablature. They really wouldn't, the music in tablature really wouldn't have the key, and you'd have to know what the tuning was. If something was actually written in a key, if it was written in notes, that's a different story. Not everything was written in notes. But it's reentrant tuned on the 1st string, not the 4th string. The quattro is reentrant at the first string. So instead of this string being up an octave, this string is down an octave. Bum, bum, bum. With step. What we suspect, we can't know for sure, what we suspect is that the range of strings that they were able to make in the New World was smaller than it was in the Old World, just because the technology didn't transfer as well. But that has a heritage going back almost as far as anybody's bothered to keep records in Venezuela. Another one that's interesting is from the Canaries, from Madeira, is an instrument called the cavaco and its smaller cousin, the cavaquillo. And these instruments were much smaller and tuned much higher. And these were the instruments that were taken by Portuguese cabinet makers who were hired by business interests in Hawaii to help them set up the cattle industry. And that instrument is the instrument that became, in the 19th century, ukulele. And then in the 1950s, on the mainland, we made the thing really, really big and called it a baritone ukulele. So we've kind of gone from, we have the guitar in Spain. The Portuguese leave it in the dryer too long, so it shrinks and it goes to Madeira. Truthfully, it's because people in Madeira couldn't afford to waste a big hunk of piece of wood on a guitar, so they built them smaller. And then these guys go to Hawaii, where the Hawaiians take it, fall in love with the thing, and it becomes their national instrument. And then in the early 20th century, the mainlanders fall in love with everything Hawaiian back in the 1920s. And here we are back to playing an instrument that is the great-great-grandson of the original instrument from Spain, and we can play the same music on it. So it's kind of cool how that works out. There's something I would love to do, but it's all mostly post-period, is to take the little 4-string guitar of Portugal and trace all the places where they went. Because if you look at where the Portuguese had foreign colonies, they took this little thing everywhere. And these little four-string guitars crop up all over the world. And every country where they landed has their own little spin on it. There's a version that has scalloped frets, so you can play all these microtones. And there's versions of this thing everywhere. I mean, there's tons around the Caribbean. Every little island, every little village, every little island has taken this thing and they've done different things with it. You go to Puerto Rico, they've got 15 different guitars, and they're all descended from the cavaquinho or the cavaco. It's astonishing. Unfortunately, most of it's post-period, but it's really amazing to look at. Okay, we're running up against 10. So what questions do y'all have? Listen to me babble, babble, babble.
What advice do you have on actually selecting an ukulele off the shelf to be able to use to get into playing?
Off the shelf is important. Don't, ideally what you do is you get together with your buddy who plays guitar or ukulele, and you go to a place that has a whole bunch of them. And try them all. Now, you know, most of my ukes are mid-priced, nothing special. I was back east visiting family and I didn't buy one. I went to Guitar Center and found their house brand, which is cheap. And half the ones I pulled off the wall were unplayable. Their intonation was wrong. You know, you play at the 12th fret, it's not an octave. You know, everything that could be wrong with them was wrong with it. But I found one that really played really, really well. But if you're a beginner, you don't know that. So you're going to play, you might play a guitar or ukulele, a mandolin, whatever, and you might not notice that, hey, this thing doesn't sound so good up the neck. And you might be okay for your first week of playing, but eventually you're going to be fighting the thing. So it really helps to go shopping with someone who knows what, at least what they're looking for, and can help you avoid a truly bad one. That said, it's kind of hard to buy one that's truly awful nowadays because, well, Chinese mass production has caught up with luthier. So the cheapest guitars and ukuleles and mandolins and things you can buy now, I actually have the book. Is that his book? Anyway, the cheapest fretted instruments you can buy now are actually not bad. You can still find a clunker, but so it does help to go with someone who you know. Where are you located?
I live in South Lake Tahoe, California. There's a guitar center in Reno that I have built a pretty good relationship with. I already play guitar, so
okay, so you know
it's
exactly
mostly just branching out.
Yeah, exactly the same problems you can have with a guitar, you can have on a ukulele, you can have on a mando, whatever. So you know what to look for. So you can go through the ones that they have, and honestly, the what are the three most important things about an instrument? How it looks, and how it looks. If it inspires you to play, it's the right ukulele for you. If it inspires you to play, it's the right guitar for you. And really nothing else matters, because if you're not inspired to play, I mean, once we have a baseline of playable instrument, if it inspires you to play, you'll play it more, and then you'll get better.
Can I tag on to that?
Sure.
I agree with you 100%. The most important thing about an instrument is that it inspires you to want to play. Having said that, no amount of inspiration will make up for a guitar that is inherently difficult to play. So yes, for myself, I would say the most important thing, if you're just going out to buy your first guitar, is the height of the action. If the action is really high, there's a lot of string tension, and that's just going to increase the pain level. A lot of times we talk about learning how to play this instrument. We don't talk about, calluses on your fingers and that kind of thing. And if you pick up an instrument and you are struggling to make the most basic chords and your fingers have giant dents in them, you're going to be unhappy. So, I would say a very close second, at least in my opinion as a guitarist, is the action on the strings, how far you have to push them down and how much tension that takes.
Yeah, that's why I prefer shopping at Elderly in Lansing to Guitar Center just down the street, is because if the cheapest guitar or ukulele that Elderly sells, they will set up at least so that it plays fairly well. Which the big box stores aren't always as diligent about. You do get away with a little bit more with the shorter scale. With shorter scale in the ukulele, it is a little bit more forgiving of bad setups. But yeah, you don't want to be fighting a bad setup. As the story picking through all of everything in the store to find the one ukulele that actually could play. Nowadays, we talk about the 4 chords. The Axis of Awesome has the presentation where they have 4 chords. All the songs use the same 4 chords. In period, those 4 chords were called Romanesca, or Guardame las vacas, which means watch out for the cows. This is Mudara's take on Romanesca.